I've tried to sort through these here. You've answered a lot of these questions, but maybe a comment or two. Benghazi, a little on the technical side, you know, in retrospect, what did we know, when did we know it, and could it have been avoided?
Quick answer, yes, it could have been, should have been avoided. The security flaws have been articulated by the State Department's own independent review board led by Ambassador Tom Pickering and retired Joint Chiefs Chairman Admiral Mike Mullen. There was no military option, again, because the Pentagon had its closest tactical units in Spain, not in Africa, and so there was no way for them to get there in time. There were no armed predators, there were only unarmed predators, so they had oversight, they had visual intelligence, but they did not have any way to get a team in or to take action. The other problem with the talking points was more related to the fact that the Benghazi mission was a CIA outpost. It was not an embassy. And they were falling all over themselves for the first few days to avoid saying that it was CIA. So the poor State Department spokespeople, not only were they grieving because they'd lost their close friends and colleagues, but they were not permitted to publicly say it wasn't our job, it was the CIA's job. They had this large outpost, which was supposedly there to collect weapons from the former militias. So it was botched from the beginning, but I truly don't think it is the scandal. It's a tragedy, and it is, there were plenty of mistakes made, but I don't think there was a scandal or a cover-up the way some of the more conservative outlets have been claiming.
This is the other question, the other part of it, just it's an opinion. Do you think it has real legs that will stay with, assuming that Hillary is the candidate, that will stay with her throughout the election?
I could be wrong about this. First of all, no one's asked, but yes, I think Hillary is running, barring some unforeseen event. She's got a campaign in place. It's never been disbanded. Every indication is that she is running for president, and I don't think that Benghazi alone would be enough to slow her down. She's at 70% in the Democratic primary. She will be the Democratic nominee. Whether in a general election, that and other things in her State Department tenure are yet to be reported, perhaps that becomes more of an issue. What is her real platform? What her challenge will be to be a forward-looking candidate, to show that she is not history, that she is the future, because she will be one of the older candidates, and she needs to show what she would do as president and not just run on the past. But I think she has enormous support among women and also among many men. And if she doesn't run too far to the left in primaries, and if she doesn't have a left-wing challenge, she won't have to, I think she might pick up a lot of Republican support.
Here's a really interesting one here. There's two questions here. You can only comment on. One question is, Obama has essentially withdrawn from the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and is being outmaneuvered by Putin. How do you see this lack of leadership, and what happens to the future? Okay, here's another question. Why did Obama say that he was going to withdraw from military involvement in Syria and so forth, and he hasn't done it? He hasn't done nearly enough of it. So there you go. There you go.
If I were Secretary of State, if I were president, he feels he was elected on a mandate to end Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is not ending the way they thought it would end, because they have not been able to negotiate a residual force agreement with Karzai, and now have decided they basically have to wait till after Karzai leaves office this spring and the new election is held, because they can't work out a deal with him. So these wars are not ending neatly. Wars don't. But he really believes that the United States does not want him to be engaged in these wars. The Syria question is much more complex, I think, because that was on his watch. It started 3 years ago. The death toll has been horrendous. There is enormous pressure from the Persian Gulf states and allies to do something to arm the rebels. The intelligence chiefs from Saudi Arabia and from Abu Dhabi were all in Washington last week for meetings with Susan Rice on how to arm the rebels. But only today we see that an al-Qaeda mediator who was in Syria trying to resolve disputes between 2 or 3 or more factions of rebels was assassinated in a suicide bombing. And the rebels fired their commander last week. So the president would say to his national security team, if we were all sitting in that room, which rebels are we going to arm, and which ones of them do we want to give those shoulder-fired missiles who will then be using them against us and our allies down the road? Now, the countervailing opinion is the head of the National Intelligence Director, Jim Clapper, testified 2 weeks ago that the al-Qaeda supported elements in Syria among the rebel factions are now a direct threat to Europe and to the homeland because they're exporting their fighters to Europe and then can get into the United States. So I don't know how you answer the question about what to do about Syria. John McCain would say we should have done something with airstrikes 3 years ago. We should have armed the rebels 3 years ago. John Kerry was trying to decide who were the moderates and has spent the last year just trying to find those moderate rebels. It reminds you of what happened in Iran, back in Iran-Contra. And, we didn't do the airstrikes on chemical weapons on Labor Day weekend, and that may prove to be a real turning point in the way the president is perceived overseas.
There are a number of questions here about civility and whether there's anything that you think can really be done about it. I'll cover that in. There's also a question here about would you care to express your opinion on the best decision that the president has made and on the worst decision that he's made since he's been in office?
Boy.
You don't have to answer that.
I'm not sure it's the best decision, but I think one of the best decisions was to support same-sex marriage. I think that's where the country is moving. That's where the nation needs to be in terms of human rights and civil rights, and it was an inconsistent position for him in the past. He said he was evolving, but I think it was a very important civil rights decision. We're now seeing, by the way, a dispute in the gay activist community because there's a potential referendum to be placed on the ballot in Ohio. There is a Quinnipiac poll today that shows that 51% of Ohioans support same-sex marriage, or support, I should say, reversing the ban on same-sex marriage. The national gay rights groups do not want to have that referendum to try to overturn the ban this November because they don't think they'd win. They don't think that in a midterm election they'd get enough people out. So they're having their own tactical problems. But I think that that was a major decision for the president to be consistent. I think one of his worst decisions was not vigorously supporting Simpson Bowles. I think it was our last decent chance to get something done on the budget.
You touched on this next question already, but it's an interesting angle. Given the capabilities of Iran, do you think that there's any reason to believe that they would really decrease their efforts to create nuclear weapons to the extent that would be necessary to appease the Israelis?
It's an existential threat for Israel. I get that. I'm sure many people here have visited Israel. You know the scale of the threat. I do think that Iran, because of its strong support in Europe, is going to be reintegrated into the world community, whether Israel or the United States likes it or not. Already, French businessmen and German businessmen are lining up in Davos making deals. So the sanctions, I don't think we're going to be sustainable. And the best chance we have right now is to see what's out there. The best sense that I have, I met President Rouhani when he was here for the UN meetings, is that he's got a very short window. He's got 6 months maybe before the hardliners move in for the kill and shut this down. So if we can explore what might be possible, I don't think that they can break out with the UN monitors everywhere. Yes, they've cheated in the past, but that's when we didn't have eyes on them. And so I think for this period, this is a safe and, in fact, an intelligent alternative. The problem will be if we don't negotiate a verifiable agreement within the 6-month framework, and then there's pressure politically here to keep it going, and pressure obviously from Europe and from around the world to keep it going. And then Israel will begin to feel, well, we have a very small window to shut this down ourselves militarily. Israel has some problems doing it without our help, and they have certainly been told in no uncertain terms that we're not going to give them the refueling that they would need. But I would never challenge Israel's options militarily. They've proved time and time again, most recently when they took out that Korean reactor in Syria, that they can do a lot of things with very, very little notice.
There were a number of questions about Ukraine. You addressed it in your remarks, and I don't know that you can do it any better than that. But basically, they say, is it likely that Putin will intervene in a military way? Is it realistic to think that that could happen?
I wouldn't completely rule it out. This could be another Georgia, because if he feels threatened, that's why you're seeing this very careful dance where the U.S. is not saying, we're in this and the European Union is in this. Apparently, Russia's finance minister was part of the conversations with the EU. There was a Russian representative with the Polish and French and German foreign ministers who were there at the meetings for the short-term deal that then was basically made moot by the rapid departure and the parliamentary vote to get rid of the president. I would not rule out that Russia would take some military action. He already has his naval assets there. The real fear would be that this becomes another Yugoslavia and that the country breaks up. And I think it is just critically important that we work with Russia. Up until this happened, the U.S. was thinking about trying to come up with another bilateral meeting between Obama and Putin, because remember, the president canceled his meeting with Putin last summer. They only met at the G20. So there is going to be a G8 meeting in Russia in Sochi this summer, and there's a possibility of a U.S.-Moscow one-on-one summit, but it will all depend on what happens in Ukraine between now and then.
Last question. It's part of two, but it's a good one. Would you care to comment on who was your most interesting female interview? And then the last question is, what advice would you give a young woman starting out in your profession today?
Those are great questions. I would have to say it's a tie between Hillary Clinton and Margaret Thatcher. Do you see a similarity there? Margaret Thatcher was just tough as nails. I got to know her pretty well, and then got to know her through my husband, who was very close to her as well. So that was a privilege. She was extraordinary, and the relationship between Thatcher and Reagan was just a wonder to watch as they felt besieged by Mitterrand and Trudeau and the other, social Democrats in various countries who surrounded them. They were the two cold warriors standing alone for a while, and it was just fascinating. And she was so tough. I remember when she once said to Leslie Stahl on Face the Nation, when Leslie was questioning her about so-called Star Wars, which was a pejorative term, strategic defense initiative, and remember how that was derided, but it actually did influence the end of the Cold War in terms of the Russian calculation and their defense spending. And so Leslie was pressing ahead with her interview live on CBS, and Maggie Thatcher said, "Don't be so negative. Why are you so negative? You're always asking these negative questions." Well, that's what you faced with Maggie Thatcher live on the Today Show. I used to interview her live on Today, and it was just really tough. Hillary is tough in a different way. I mean, she's obviously charming and not as combative, but she's very well defended, very, very smart. And to understand Hillary Clinton as a candidate vis-a-vis the press, those of us who started covering her in 1991 and covered her all through the 92 campaign and that horrible, introduction to the presidential candidate's life with what happened in New Hampshire, the draft, the whole Jennifer Flowers thing. I mean, that was just really putting her through the worst possible initiation. And so she viewed the press, and if you read some of the recent documents from Diane Blair, and I don't refer to the ones that were so celebrated, but the diary recollections about Hillary's views during Whitewater and Travelgate, Vince Foster's death, her own father's death. Bill Clinton's mother died, a woman I knew and liked very, very much, Bill Clinton's mom. They went through the worst couple of years in the first few years in the White House, and she became very toughened and battle-weary. And you see that reflected in that diary. So it's hard to interview her. She's a completely different person socially and on the plane and off the record, but she's fascinating. She's an endlessly fascinating character. And just one recollection, 1995, we're leaving Beijing. On the way into Beijing to the women's conference, she was the first lady. It's an all-woman press corps. And we were warned how to detect the hidden cameras in our hotel rooms and bathrooms by the Secret Service, to fog up the bathroom, and you'll see where it doesn't fog over on the mirror. That's where the camera aperture is, and to put a paper or a towel over that. I mean, so we were all given the Secret Service briefing on the plane with the First Lady, because we were going to the Beijing Women's Conference, and then Hillary declares memorably, famously, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. And it was a clarion call, and the Chinese hated it. And so we were under pressure. We then went to the next session in a monsoon-like rain, and the police moved in and tried to stop our delegation, because the press were mixed in with the delegation for security reasons. They tried to prevent us from getting in. It was very, very bad police operation. So we got to the plane to fly to, of all places, Mongolia. And I have a picture of Hillary and me and Milan Verveer and all of us cheering as we left Chinese airspace, because we had been so beleaguered, and we were so thrilled to get to Mongolia, which is actually a very interesting place. But it just, she is a lot of you know her. She's a completely different person when she's not on guard. She is brilliant. She is indefatigable. And it's tough to cover her, because she's been through so much that there is sort of a carapace about that, that she is not easy to interview. But I think I'm going to have a lot more opportunities going forward. And thank you again. It's not as big as a Sony TV. Thank you, because I have a commercial flow.